Hello, everyone. My name is David Mackay. I am a white settler originally from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. This land is located in the Pacific Northwest of Canada. I am an associate professor and the associate director of the theater program here at K-State, and I will be facilitating our discussion entitled Occupying Indigenous Land, Recognizing K-State's History Through Kansa, Kansas Perspectives. This 50-minute conversation will be with our distinguished guests, James Pepper Henry, Chester Hubbard, and Charlie Huffman. I'd just like to take this moment to play the video of the K-State University's land acknowledgement.
As the first institution established under the 1862 Morrill Act, we acknowledge that the state of Kansas is, historically, home to many native nations, including the Kaw, Osage, and Pawnee, among others. Furthermore, Kansas is the current home to 4 federally recognized native nations: the Prairie Band Potawatomi, the Kickapoo Tribe of Kansas, the Iowa Tribe of Kansas and Nebraska, and the Sac and Fox Nation Missouri in Kansas and Nebraska.
Many native nations utilize the western plains of Kansas as their hunting grounds, and others, such as the Delaware, were moved through this region during Indian removal efforts to make way for white settlers. It's important to acknowledge this, since the land that serves as the foundation of this institution was, and still is, stolen land.
We remember these truths because K-State's status as a land-grant institution is a story that exists within ongoing settler colonialism and rests on the dispossession of Indigenous peoples and nations from their lands. These truths are often invisible to many. The recognition that K-State's history begins and continues through Indigenous contexts is essential.
Please remember
these truths
because we still remember.
Very nice.
Thank you. And I want to let me escape. There we are. Great, thank you. This is the second part of a discussion that we began in February with K-State School of Music, Theater, and Dance during our Ideal Week. Our first discussion was with K-State faculty members, Dr. Alex Redcorn and Dr. Lisa Tenetti, who are joining us today. So thank you for joining us again. And again, thank you for beginning this important conversation and discussion. The Ideal Committee is in our School of Music, Theater, and Dance, and it stands for Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity for All. And one of our first initiatives was to get the land acknowledgement spoken before all our performances. I'd like to take this moment now to introduce our guests. James Pepper Henry is the Executive Director and CEO of the First Americans Museum, a new cultural institution located in Oklahoma City. Its mission is to educate the broader public about the unique cultures, diversity, history, and contributions of the 39 federally recognized tribes that were removed to Indian Territory, now the state of Oklahoma. The museum opened to the public in September 21. Congratulations. Jim is a member of the Kaw Nation and is of the Muskogee Creek Heritage. He is the inaugural director of the Kaw Nation's Kansa Museum. Currently, Jim serves as vice chairman of the Kaw Nation, one of the federally recognized native nations in Oklahoma. Welcome, James. And I'm just making sure everyone's here. Yep. Second of all, we have Chester Hubbard. Chester is a member of the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation and is also Choctaw and Seneca Cayuga. He is a senior in Kansas State University's Geography Department. Chester works with the Chapman Center for Rural Studies on K-State's Treaty Project, which explores the history of our region through primary documents about the Kaw Nation. Welcome, Chester. Also joining us is Charlie Huffman, who is diligently searching for linguistic intersections and a four-way go working towards articulating the constant train wreck in the brain. The methodology involved in invoking this phenomenon requires Charlie to sit and stare for hours at a time. Also, cooking sometimes happens with desukui. I hope I pronounced that right. I do know it's sweet potato. And she has an MFA from the City University of New York and an MDiv from Union Theological Seminary, an advocate at the crossroads of indigeneity and dis/ability. She is a poet and a theologian. She is a Kaw Nation citizen. Welcome, the three of you. Thanks so much for joining us. Just like to add, Charlie, that is one of my favorite bios I've ever read. Thank you for that. But welcome for joining us for this important discussion. So as I mentioned, our school, the School of Music, Theater, Dance here at K-State, we read the land acknowledgement aloud before every one of our performances, recitals, and gathering where students perform. The land acknowledgement, a land acknowledgement, is becoming common for a number of performing venues across the US and Canada. Also in Canada, there is a land acknowledgement on the Jumbotron before NHL hockey games. I think the Chicago Blackhawks also does a land acknowledgement before their games. And I do want to recognize that this is a beginning, but also know that it is not enough. And hopefully this encourages discussion like the one we're going to have today. So letting the last few people in. My first question is, what does the land colonially known as Kansas mean to you, particularly given the history of forced removal and displacement? And I would open that up. Who would ever like to address that?
Well, I'm happy to address that as someone who is a member of the Kaw Nation. And for us, the land that is known as Kansas now is our homeland. We did not leave what is now Kansas voluntarily. And we still think of Kansas as our home. Of course, the state bears our name. And when I return to Kansas, I always feel like I'm coming home, but it's not quite home yet. And I know a lot of us, and I've talked to Charlie about this, who's also a member of the Kaw Nation, that at some point in our future, we would love to have a much greater presence in Kansas and have many of our Kaw people return back to Kansas. We do have Kaw citizens that live in Kansas, but it would be nice to see some of the land come back to us at some point in time. And when I'm there in Kansas, especially in the Council Grove area, which is where the Kaws were last living before we were removed to Kansas, I always think about, especially when the wind's blowing a little bit, I think Kansas is a lot like Oklahoma, where the wind's either blowing one direction or the other direction. But I think about that, and I look at the particles in the air and the dust, and I think, that's the essence of our ancestors who were buried there in the land. And so it means a lot to me. And you may have read or know that we're working on several projects in Kansas right now, including the return of our prayer rock that is in Lawrence, Kansas, having that returned back to the Kaw people, something that's very sacred to us, that was culturally appropriated by white settlers coming in. So, and that's a whole different conversation. But now, especially the generation that I'm in with the Kaw Nation, we're previous to these times, we were just trying to survive. We, after being removed from Kansas, we were 20,000 people strong around the time Lewis and Clark came through Kansas, and by about 1920, we went from 20,000 people to 165 people. And Charlie and I are the survivors and the descendants of the last surviving members of our tribe, of the Kaw Nation. So, I think for most Kansans, we're invisible. We don't exist to most Kansans. If you were to ask, if you got 10 Kansans in the room, 9 out of 10 would not even know that the name of the state comes from our people. And I remember as a young man, I was working in Washington, D.C. for the Smithsonian Institution, and I met Senator Dole on the steps of the United States Capitol. And Bob, of course, you know Bob Dole, longtime senator from Kansas. And I went up to him and I introduced myself to him. And I said, my name is James Pepper Henry. I'm a member of the Kaw Nation. And he looked at me and I said, Kaw. And then I said, Kansa. Then I said, Kansa. He had no idea that his state that he represented for all those years in Congress, in the United States Senate, was named after our people.
And I think that is really key. and what James is saying is, you know, the lack of memory. So when you ask something like, what does it mean to me? What does it mean to James? You know, what does it mean to Chester? Like this in many ways, you know, of course it's going to mean something to us. And you could get 3 Kaw citizens in the room and you're going to get 4 different opinions and 4 different stories, right? Because my story of diaspora, right? And James's story, right, of how he grew up, and people's stories of being in Oklahoma, right? These are all different stories, and our relationship to the land there, right, is going to be different, but they're all going to be stories of shokhi, right? Stories of coming home, stories of return, right? But really what the question is what is your relationship to the land?
Yeah, no, that is an excellent.
And I'm not asking you personally.
No, I know. No, I know. I wouldn't venture to answer that. But this phrase "not quite home," and it is your home, is very impactful.
Because we're in a process of return.
Yes.
Can I tell you a story?
Please do.
When I was much younger, I visited Kansas with my uncle Luther. He was vice chairman of the Kaw Nation at that time, and I'm vice chairman now of the Kaw Nation. But we visited Kansas and went to a lot of historic sites around Kansas, and we visited Council Grove, Kansas, and there's a monument to the unknown Kaw warrior right outside of Council Grove, which is now part of our tribal park. But this was private land at that time. It was owned by, it was farmland, and we had initial conversations with the landowner, and he was very interested in selling the land to the tribe. That he wanted this monument to be within the ownership of the tribe. And so we talked about it. Went back to the tribe. I was the historic preservation officer for the tribe back then. This was in the mid 1990s. And I met with the tribal council, and we decided to purchase the land, 115 acres or so. And prior to that, the city of Council Grove would host this festival called Washunga Days. And we come up every year. It's in the middle of June. We come up every year as a tribe, and they parade us down the street. And we wave to all the people on the side of the street, and we have a dance there in Council Grove, and everybody's happy, and we have a good time. And then we leave. We're there for 2 or 3 days, and we're gone. And when we got the word out that we were considering buying land in Council Grove, that attitude completely changed. And back in the 1860s, early 1870s, before we were removed from Kansas, the papers would describe our people as dirty, filthy people, beggars, people begging for food. We were on hard times, almost starving with the government commodities that were promised to us that we never received. And people would just describe us as filthy people that we needed to be eradicated like rats. And eventually we were moved to northern Oklahoma. And then fast forward 100 years later, I'm with my uncle, we're talking about buying land, and they said, we don't want these dirty Indians here. They're gonna come, they're gonna bring a casino, they're gonna bring drugs, they're gonna bring their crime, so it was, nothing had changed in 100 years in terms of the attitude of the people there. The only thing that had changed was that we would show up for a few days and everybody loves us, and then we would leave. But the idea of us coming back and setting up any kind of residence there, having any kind of presence, just all that racism and everything else just came to the surface again, and we're still struggling with that today. But we said we're not here to build a casino. We're here to have a presence again in a state that bears our name. That's the only land that we own in Kansas right now is Alagawahu Memorial Park. That's the 115 acres that we purchased. And but I'm telling you, people were freaking out when they thought we were coming back to Kansas. And that is still there, is still within your community right there, that attitude just under the surface. So it's nice to think, oh, it'd be nice for you to come back to Kansas. It'd be nice for you to have some of your land back, but there's going to be a lot of resistance when that day comes.
Thank you, James. Yeah, and this complication of this resistance is huge, and needs to be the how to, a whole other topic on how to change and begin that conversation, negotiation. But thank you for those stories. Chester, I wonder if you had anything to add.
Yeah, like especially because the Prairie Band Potawatomi, this isn't our traditional homeland. We're from the eastern woodlands up north, and well, northeast, I guess. But like it's kind of a conflicting feeling because Kansas is the current home of my tribe and my family and myself, but it's not our traditional homeland. And so we came here back in the 1800s, and like they told us that this is where we were supposed to stay, and like so we kind of made a life here. And like my Mishos, like they've always talked about how much they love Kansas and how it's their home, and how the Flint Hills is some of the most beautiful land to them. And like it's kind of just interesting because, like I said, it's not our original homeland, but it's now our home. So it's just kind of a conflicting feeling.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for providing this information. Thank you so much. If I may, I'd like to go on to the second question. Melissa Peterson, the Director of Tribal Relations at the University of Kansas, has discussed the ways in which she considers the land acknowledgement a challenge in her work. She notes, quote, "It means unpacking and uncovering history," unquote. How do each of you think about the land acknowledgement employed at your current or past institutional affiliations?
And I'm happy to address that, and I'm gonna throw a wrench in all of this, and in a minute.
Okay.
And but I do want to talk about Kansas is very complicated, just as Chester talked about with its indigenous communities, because Chester's community is not indigenous to Kansas. The Kaw Nation is not indigenous to Oklahoma. There were tribes that were here before the arrival of other tribes, and tribes that were here temporarily and have left. And so it's very, very complicated, and developing any kind of land acknowledgement for Kansas or Oklahoma is that much more compounded with the fact that you've got indigenous tribes that are no longer here. You've got other tribes that were displaced from their homelands that are in Kansas now. You have other tribes that were here for a short period of time and then moved out to other places. And I would like to share with you a document that we developed at First Americans Museum that helps us and helps others.
Why am I logged in as Rowan?
What's that?
Oh, so sorry.
So I will share this document with you. If this is, can you see that? Can everybody see this? Yes?
Yes, we can see it. Yes, we can.
Okay.
Thank you.
So these are some of the things that we like to share with people for them to think about as they're developing a land acknowledgement. And here at our museum, and where our museum is situated, was the homeland of the Wichita and Caddo people, and then to a larger extent with the Tonkawan Apache as larger territory as their extended territory. And so we thought about this, and we, first of all, we wanted to recognize the original tribes that were in this area, just as you have done in your land acknowledgement. And again, those tribes are the Apache, Caddo, Tonkawa, and Wichita. There are other tribes that were moved, or that use this as broader territory for hunting and trade and other relationships. The Comanche, Kiowa, Osage, and Waupun, you've done a great job in your land acknowledgement in that too. But we don't call the tribes here Oklahoma tribes. And because we're not from Oklahoma, we don't belong to Oklahoma. In fact, we're sovereign nations that have the same status as the state of Oklahoma. And so we say we are tribes that are in the boundaries of the state of Oklahoma, but we do not belong to Oklahoma. We are our own people. We are our own nations. We talk about displacement. We think about the displacement of our people. That you know, we talk about the resiliency and the perseverance of our people being removed from our homelands. Not only being removed from our homelands, but then being forced to go to boarding school, to give up our languages, to give up our cultural lifeways, and then having our land broken up into allotments through the Allotment Act. And we recognize all of that as we developed our land acknowledgement. We refer to our people in the present tense. We don't refer to people in the past. And that's very important too, because again, there's this erasure of us from the landscape, from the narrative, that somehow we're in the past, we're not in the present. And then we don't contribute to society, but we do in many, many ways. And then I mentioned recognizing the sovereignty of our nations. We are separate and distinct from the state of Oklahoma. Each tribe has its own unique stories, its language and cultural lifeways. Here in Oklahoma, there are 39 federally recognized tribes. Those 39 tribes, by the way, there are 573 tribes in the United States that are recognized by the federal government. 39 of those are in Oklahoma, but those 39 tribes represent 60% of all Native Americans in the United States. So the vast majority of Native Americans are members of tribes in Oklahoma, and we all have different languages. We all have different cultural lifeways. There are at least 12 distinct language groups in Oklahoma with various dialects from there. And we try to educate our visitors about that as well, that we're not all the same. And then we encourage people to understand the tribes around us. And this is the most important part. Land acknowledgements are just words unless they're accompanied by action. And so it's one thing to say we acknowledge so-and-so to this land, but if you don't do anything about it, if you don't have programming around that, if you don't have education around that, it's just hollow words. It doesn't really mean anything to anybody. And other than just maybe pacifying some white guilt that people might have. But if you don't do anything about it, then those words are meaningless. And so then we recognize all the tribes that are here in Oklahoma now, all 39 tribal nations. And then we talk about what we're called. And we've had a lot of discussions when we were developing First Americans Museum, what we were going to call this institution. And we are not Indians, we are not from India. And I always wonder if Columbus was trying to find China, what we'd be called. And but of course, for generations, we're called Indians. My grandparents' generation called themselves Indians. My parents' generation would say American Indian, which is a little bit better, but we're still not from India. There are Indian Americans, people who are from India that live in the United States. We're still not Indians, but at least it brings it to this hemisphere, this continent. My generation would say, Generation X, we would say Native American, or we say Native American, which is even better, but it's still confusing. If you've ever filled out an employment application and you had to check the little ethnicity boxes, white, Hispanic, Asian, there's a box for Native American. 20% of all people that fill out an application will check Native American because they think they're born in the United States, therefore they're native to America, and they'll check that box. So it's still confusing to a lot of people. We look to our friends to the north, to David's homeland, the First Nations of Canada. I think, when did First Nations come around? Probably about 30, 40 years ago. The Native communities, Indigenous communities in Canada started using the term First Nations. That has some weight to it. That's reminding people that there were nations of people here before the arrival of other people from around the world. And so I think that's very powerful. And we looked at that, and we made the decision to not only rebrand our museum, but start the rebranding of an entire race of people by using the term First American. And that's very powerful as well too. A lot of other organizations are now using the term First American. And I remember having an argument with one of the state legislators when we proposed changing our name to First American. He said, well, you're not the first Americans. Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and John Adams, they were the first Americans. And I said, no, they were the first US citizens. And we're not talking about citizenship, we're talking about geography. And there's no common term among Indigenous peoples for what we call this hemisphere. And we have adopted the term America, even though it's named after Amerigo Vespucci. And so I tried to explain this to him that we're not talking about the first US citizens, we're talking about the first Americans, the first people of this hemisphere. And I reminded him that, in fact, American Indians, or first Americans, were the last people to have our citizenship in this country. We didn't have our citizenship until 1924. We did not have universal voting rights in this country until 1965. That was 1 year before I was born. We did not have universal voting rights in this country. So in a lot of ways, we are the last Americans when you think of it from that context, but we are the first peoples of this continent, of the contiguous United States. And so I think that makes a very powerful statement too, as people start to think about this and think about developing these land acknowledgements. And I will share another document with you real quick. And this is our actual land acknowledgement that we have here at First Americans Museum. And First Americans Museum honors the ancestors who lived here before it was Oklahoma. We honor the indigenous people who inhabited these lands before the United States was established. They include the Apache, Caddo, Tonkawa, and Wichita. We also honor those tribes who have an historic relationship to this region, including the Comanche, Kiowa, Osage, and Quapaw. We acknowledge the Muskogee Creek and Seminole, who were once assigned the land upon which this museum resides. Today, 39 distinct tribal nations reside in Oklahoma. We are as diverse culturally and linguistically as the nations on the European continent. We are not only in Oklahoma, we are not in Oklahoma by choice. Many of our peoples were removed and relocated from the far reaches of the contiguous United States. After nearly 200 years, our histories and cultural lifeways are now interwoven into this landscape. The Choctaw people call this land Oklahoma. Oklahoma means red people, the place we call home. So even though we have been displaced from our original homelands, we have now adopted this land and adapted to this land. And we have ceremonial grounds here now in Oklahoma. So that further complicates everything here too. It's not like we would just want to pack up everything here at Kaw Nation in north central Oklahoma and just move to Kansas. We now have a relationship with for several generations now where we're at. So that makes this much, much more complicated.
Thank you, James. Thank you so much. I noticed a couple people in chat, Alex and Deborah, saying that this is a much long overdue conversation here at Kansas State University. So thank you for that powerful information. Would anyone like to add to that, Charlie or Chester?
Well, so I'm going to throw a wrench into all of this. Are you ready?
Yeah, please do.
Okay,
yeah.
Here's the wrench. Here comes the wrench. I don't believe in land acknowledgements. And I'm going to tell you why. Because it's a Western ideal, the idea that somebody can own the land. It comes from Judeo-Christian theology that somehow from a Western perspective, land is a commodity. It's something that can be owned by an individual or a company or a corporation or a government. In our native way of thinking of things, we belong to the land. The land does not belong to us. In fact, if we think of the land as our mother, then we are the children of our mother. We cannot own our mother. It's something that we have come from, and we cannot own the land. And so the idea of a land acknowledgement is a Western way of thinking about this land belonged to them, now it belongs to us. I think these should be called people acknowledgements, because that's what we're really talking about. We're not talking about necessarily the land, we're talking about the people who are associated with the land. And that's my personal feeling about that, is that we belong to the land, we belong to her. It does not, or she does not belong to us or any of you. And that's the way I like to think about these things. And I know we call them land acknowledgements, but really the gist of it is we're talking about the people that were here prior to the arrival of others. And so that's my personal feeling about that. I'm in the process of writing a paper about that with some others, thinking about land acknowledgements versus people acknowledgements. But really, we cannot own the land. It doesn't belong to us.
If that's your wrench, I like your toolkit.
And see, I don't think it's a wrench at all. I think it's a wonderful building block, and it actually works really beautifully. And I'm jumping ahead a little bit, David. I hope it's okay.
Absolutely.
But you ask in terms of our language, right? And the relationship of the land and the language, and there's so much. We really can't do it in 50 minutes.
Agreed.
But one of the things that we can talk about is like in our language in Kansa, right? We have in English, we have 3 tenses. Well, we have a lot more than 3 tenses, but we have 3 that we commonly use: past, present, and future, right? In Kansa, we're going to be working more with 2, and we're going to be working with the actual, right? And we're going to be working with the potential future, right? So when we talk about something like a land acknowledgement, or with what James says, right, a people acknowledgement, what we're actually acknowledging is the actual, what has happened, right? We're linguistically connecting ourselves to the land with what has happened, what is actual. And if we're really good at it, to a potential future, right? That's what we're trying to do with this language of acknowledgement. And it's possible, right? And then we're trying to translate that into action. So that's all.
No, that's great.
Not much.
No, it's the land acknowledgement does have, as James was mentioning, the capitalistic quantifies the land. And I think, Charlie, as you mentioned, there's also a history that we as white settlers tend to put a price on it, but we tend to ignore or hide from the history, or much worse, let's be honest, much worse than that. But that sort of did lead into our next question, which you answered. I just want to post that, and you began the conversation, Charlie. Thank you. How does the land inform language and spirituality? And what are the ways in which language and spirituality inform, feed the land?
I would love to continue with this.
Yes, please.
Well, and I mean, Chester, you live up there, and the mapping work that you're doing is really helpful. And James, what you said earlier is so relevant, because we, in so much of this work, we talk about, oh, wouldn't it be amazing to rename this and to take things back to their Indigenous namings, and but so much of that is just more theft, right? These names and these places and these things are sacred to us and for us. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done, a lot of healing that needs to be done before we can even get there, right? Language can also be an assault, right? We know this, you know, the simplest form is, I mean, there's still high schools, somebody put it in the chat, right? High schools with mascots up there. I mean, not even high schools, like professional teams. You know, when, you know, James and I, we were working, there was that awful bike race, you know, that was still an assault until very recently. So, you know, when we think about how these things inform each other, it's not just a matter of, you know, us returning and saying, oh, here's our language, you know, have that too. Right. You know, so much of it is about what's being perpetrated still on the land and with the tongue in these places, that when you go up there, when, you know, when my auntie goes up there to do an educational performance in the library where she's supposed to perform, is still the words, and, you know, I can't even speak it. I can't even speak it. You know, but a plaque with the words, you know, dirty and our name. And she has to go and tell them, I won't educate you while that is on the wall above me. Right? Those are the kinds of things that when you say, what can we do? Look in your communities. Take a look around you. Like, we see it. And I'm only there a couple days a year, right? But like, language, it's not about like us bringing our language back. People in our nation are working on that real hard. Our kids are learning it. Like, we're doing our part.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Anyone have anything to add to that question?
I have just a story about language, and you have to realize that our government tried to erase our language and take our language away from us. My grandparents were sent to boarding school. For 4 generations, our children were taken from us and sent to boarding schools to adopt Christian religion, to give up our cultural life ways, and to teach us English and take our native tongue away from us. And my grandfather spoke our language when he was a young boy, and just like many others, and you've heard these stories, he would have his mouth washed out with soap at the boarding school if he spoke to his kinfolk in our tribal language. And so it was a fight. It's been a fight for us to recover our language. Our language was almost extinct. And I remember as a young man working for the Kaw Nation, I applied for an A&A grant, an Administration for Native Americans grant with the federal government to jumpstart a language program at the tribe. And we wrote the grant, and they wrote back and said, we're not going to fund you because your language is dead. It doesn't exist. And luckily for us, and there were some people that spoke a little bit of Kaw. Our neighbors, the Osages, had some fluent speakers. It was a very similar language to ours. But there was a professor there at KU, Robert Rankin, who studied the Kaw language as a young man and had recorded several of our elders at the time back in the early 1970s. And he had these reel-to-reel tapes of the Kaw language. He spent a couple summers there, recorded the whole syllabary, though it had quite a bit of our Kaw language recorded. And I heard about this in the 90s, in the mid 90s. And I made arrangements to go meet with him there at KU, and we met. And he showed me, he had recorded this, but really hadn't done much with it over the years. And it was sitting on his shelf in his office. And I said, you realize that you have something more valuable than gold or anything else sitting on the shelf. You have our language. And I said, we need to recover. We need to reclaim our language. And he said, I agree with you. And he said, I recorded your great grandfather. He's one of the people that I recorded. And I said, I remember sitting on the porch at my great grandfather's house, and he would sit. I was kind of afraid of him because he would sit there on the porch and he would talk to himself, and he would speak to himself in the Kaw language. And I asked, and he would just be talking to nobody, it looked like. And my grandfather was there, and I asked my grandfather, I said, why is great grandpa out there talking to himself? And he goes, no, he's not talking to himself. He's talking to God. And he said, God gave us this language. This is the language of God. And I'm speaking to God because I have no one else to speak to. Nobody else speaks our language. And so I knew then that it was important for us to save our language. And so fast forward to the 1990s, I met with Professor Rankin. I said, this is God's language. You have God's language. It's sitting on the shelf in your office. And I said, we've got to bring this back. And he looked at me and he said, there's no way in hell I'm letting you take these out of my office because this is the only thing that exists. And I said, okay, we'll figure this out. And we set up a recording studio in Wichita, Kansas, and he agreed to meet us. He brought one of those, those you see in the movies where they've got the metal suitcase with the chain around it, and like they're hauling money somewhere. Well, he had this suitcase he brought with him with these language tapes in there, and went to a recording studio, and they were able to digitize the reel-to-reel tapes onto CDs. And the funny thing was, he was so broke back then, he used this old German recorder, and it was at a slower speed, and he didn't have the recorder anymore, and there wasn't anything equivalent to run the tapes. And so it sounded, everybody was off speed. And so they had to figure out how to record that digitally. So we recovered what was left of our language from Robert Rankin there at KU, and used that as the basis to build our language program. And we reapplied for an ANA grant. We finally got the grant to get to hire people to come in, work with other tribes that spoke similar language to get our language program going. Charlie was one of the coordinators for our language program several years ago. And so now we have immersion classes at our tribe, and these young kids are running around talking. I need to take the class, but we've got young kids speaking Kaw now and making fun of me as an adult in Kaw because I don't understand what they're saying. And it's so wonderful that this has happened. And we almost lost a gift that we were given from God, from Wakanda, our creator. And the fact that we are able to recover this, and the fact somebody from KU is the one that saved our language is pretty incredible. So we have our language today. Young people, we're never going to speak it fluently again, but it's still integrated into our daily lives now, into the interpretation of our road signs and those things. But it's so wonderful to see young people speaking the language that I never thought I would hear again after the death of my great-grandfather.
Thank you. Thank you for that beautiful story. And thank you, Charlie. Very, very powerful. Thank you. The next question, I certainly don't want to, it's a bit of what should we do? And I feel a little, just hearing you guys talk, it feels a little not important what we should do, but I would like to ask, the School of Music, Theater, and Dance has received criticism over the phrase stolen land, which is included in our land acknowledgement. How should we respond to such critiques? Chester, what would you like me to tell someone if they had a problem with that?
God, there's so much I could say, especially about stolen lands, because like how we were just talking about, like we are relatives to the land. Like we never owned the land or nothing's like that. Especially going over like a lot of the primary documents for the treaties and all that, and just also going over like some of the historical texts for the Kansa and and the United States government. Lot of the language was kind of like, oh, like y'all own the land, and so there's always been kind of just that mindset of, we lost that land, but really it's never really been ours. And so I kind of have mixed feelings about stolen land.
Mhm. Thank you. Thanks. Charlie, yeah, would you like to say something?
Yeah, invite
do.
more Kansa. I mean, if you're asking like what you can do in
Yeah.
response to pushback, like, not whether or not it's a problematic phrase or, or this or that, but if you're asking what you can do in response to pushback, invite more Kansa Nikashinga,
Yeah.
because this is good,
Yeah, no, and I would as theater, I would like to facilitate more stories as well. That's another discussion, but that is definitely something that appeals and speaks to me. So yes, thank you.
The things that Charlie and Chester are working on, most things there have an English name, but they also have an Indigenous name. And to reclaim, you're talking about reclaiming the language and thinking of land as stolen. Well, start by recognizing these places from their Indigenous names too, and not some of this is a little challenging to research, but a lot of these places do have Indigenous names that are there that we can find, and I think that's really important too. But it's not just the land that was stolen from us. Again, talking about our language, talking about our cultural life ways, our ceremonial ways, those things were taken from us too. And stolen is a tough word. From my perspective, I don't have an issue with that, but I can understand how that can rub some people the wrong way, that people in this generation will say, well, that I didn't do that. This was my great grandparents that did this, that came in and did these things. We can't be held responsible for the things that another generation did. But my answer to that is everybody on this call, even including myself, is a beneficiary of all of that. You're a beneficiary of colonialism. You're a beneficiary of the things that were taken from us. The great wealth of this country is all based on things that were taken from and the displacement of other people. So we are all the beneficiaries of the terrible things that have happened. So there is a responsibility there, and we can't ignore that. And it doesn't mean that we're asking for everyone to give everything back, because we know that's never going to happen. But what Charlie and Chester are saying is that we need to acknowledge these things, and we can't just have lip service about these things, and that we need to incorporate the history that we don't like to talk about into our textbooks, and let people know the true history of what really happened, because otherwise it's going to happen again. It's happening in Ukraine right now. It's like what happened in Kansas is like the Russians coming in. I talk about the big red rock that's there in Lawrence. This was something that was so important to our tribe at one point in time, and it's still important to us. Something that was sacred to us. It was appropriated by the settlers, and they put a plaque on it dedicating it to the hardships of the pioneers that came in. Well, that's like Vladimir Putin coming in and killing everybody in the eastern part of Ukraine and putting a plaque on the local church saying, we're dedicating this to the hardships of the Russian people who came into Ukraine. So it's very similar. I see a lot of parallels happening in Ukraine right now. And of course, we're all up in arms about that, but something very similar happened here, and that ethnic cleansing of the land. And so it's complicated, and I wish I had all the answers to this, but at least we're talking about it on this Zoom call right now in this forum, and that's something that wouldn't have happened 20, 30 years ago. So this is a step in the right direction, but I think again, acknowledging the people that were here before, we're still here too, and that's important for people to understand too.
Thank you. Our last question. For all of you, can you discuss the hashtag land back movement and what it means to you?
I don't know if Chester wants to answer that one.
Chester, yeah?
So yeah, geez. Man, land back is just more than, having traditional homelands returned to, to people who live there, hunted there and all that. It's more than that. It's also respecting our rights as a people. It's about preserving our languages and traditions. It's about ensuring that we can still have clean air and water for our peoples, because a lot of that's still ignored to this day. There's still all these people out there that are still not being able to do any of that or have any of that. So land back to me it's always been more just the land. It's about a lot of our ways and culture.
I think it should be hashtag dignity back. We'd like to have our dignity back. And this intergenerational trauma that we've had from all of this displacement but that's something that we need to do for ourselves. And I don't know that anybody can actually give that back to us. I think we have to within our own communities, we have to be proud of our heritage and who we are as a people and where we've come from, and not let other people tell us that we're worthless and that we were a people that were just in the way and we needed to get out of the way, be moved out of the way. And so we are working to bring our own dignity back and reclaiming our right to self-governance, reclaiming our sovereignty, reclaiming our right to determine our future, rather than having somebody else dictate where we can live and how we can live and what we can do. And we're seeing that today. Many tribes now are getting their dignity back because we're being more assertive about our future and about how we govern ourselves. And so I think that's really important. And the land is just part of that.
Thank you.
I would actually like to borrow from the Germans, if I may. They have a word that's terrific. It's called Erinnerungskultur, and it means memory culture. And it came about after, in the second half of the 20th century. I think we're all pretty familiar with the Germans' need for memory culture in the second half of the 20th century. And, German academics got together and said, hey, we need to practice memory culture and Erinnerungskultur. And for me, land back, in addition to Monzeska, right, paying real land tax, like money, putting money into our justice programs and, Indigenous rights funds and, as James and Chester said, but also land back to me means memory culture and, that preservation. So.
Thank you. That's great. No, that's great. Thank you so much. I would like to ask if there are any people who would have any questions for members of our panel or something they've heard. There's many people. Oh, I see a hand up. Sean, would you like to say your question, please? Ask your question.
Yes, thank you so much. Sorry. Yes, thank you so much. I'm new to this area, and this is something I really need to learn more about. I appreciate you sharing all this with us today. What really struck me was this idea of land acknowledgements being an artifact of basically Western philosophy, right? That really hit home with me. That was a philosophy major, and I'm thinking about John Locke and how the framers of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence basically used that very philosophy to justify their own, the idea that the land belonged to them, but also to ironically stealing it from the people who it rightly belonged to from their frame, right? Not from the frame of the first Americans. My question is, because of those thoughts, what might be a way of acknowledging that the spirit of the first Americans, the spirit of the first Americans' relationship with the land? So rather than saying like a land acknowledgement, is there a way to kind of acknowledge this idea that you can't own the land, and that's a Western concept? Is there a way to kind of bring that forward as we think about how to do this work? At least raising awareness of that very concept, I think, is really, really important. So thank you again.
Well, I'd like to say that the idea of land acknowledgement is a good one, but as you said, it's rooted in the doctrine of discovery and the fact that if you're not Christian, then you're less than human, and you can't own the land, or you can't have the land. And that just gave, carte blanche for people to come in and as an excuse to displace Indigenous peoples and basically take that territory, that land. So, but we're on the right track. I don't have all the answers here, but again, thinking of it as a people acknowledgement, I don't know if they should be called people acknowledgements, but and the people's connection to the land, I think that's really important. So I don't know what the alternative would be of calling it a land acknowledgement. Right, for the moment, I'm calling them people acknowledgements, but I'm glad that you recognize that still it's that land, calling it a land acknowledgement and tying things to the land as a commodity is not an Indigenous ideal or perspective, and it's rooted in Western capitalism, basically.
Thank you. Would someone else like to ask a question?
I have a question.
Thank you. I'm sorry. Who's speaking? I have so many names.
It's Deborah Bolton.
Oh, hi, Deborah. Thank you.
Hello. First, I'd like to say to James Pepper Henry, I was at the FAM yesterday. It's a fabulous, fabulous place, and I was in the bookstore or the store, and I was saying, oh well, I was telling about that. So I gave them the poster of this presentation today, and I don't know if any of them came, but anyway, it was kind of cool. Here's my question. I'm actually a trustee for the Nature Conservancy, and I kind of grapple with this because we talk a lot about monetizing ecosystems. And someone asked me, as an Indigenous person, how do you feel about monetizing ecosystems? And I said, well, it's kind of akin to human trafficking, because we believe that the ecosystems, we believe the land, we believe nature is our relatives. And, they were pretty taken aback by that. But maybe you might have a suggestion for a more intelligent response from me that isn't so snarky.
Snarky's pretty good, though.
Yeah, I think that's great.
Well, it's just such a, here this entity is raising money because they want to preserve land. But it's everything's based on a capitalistic point of view. And they keep saying, well, we want indigenous knowledge, indigenous ways. And I'm thinking, well, that might be the first step toward that, but that's a tough one. And
well, and so somebody asked me, well, well, can you go back and live off the land like you used to? And I said, well, obviously not, because there are fences. And when I mean by fences, I'm talking about literal fences where there are fences everywhere. There are walls everywhere. There are fences everywhere. There are boundaries everywhere. But it's also a metaphor for the other fences that we have. The systemic racism that we have in policies and that are not to the benefit of people of color. The fences of capitalism and all those things we're never going to go back to the way it was. And even conserving the land, it's important. And we have the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve, there in Kansas, as well as another one in northern Oklahoma. And those are important. I think we need to preserve, we need to have these spaces, but they're still going to have to be managed because we have fences. The ecosystem, in a way, can't take care of itself anymore unless you remove people from the equation. And so, unfortunately, it is going to take financial resources to help preserve something that was fine without human beings being there, or fine without colonization. And I just want to remind people that colonization wasn't an event. Colonization is something that's happening every second of every day in perpetuity into the future. We can't reverse it right now. And people always ask me, well, are you into decolonizing the museum? And I said, well, you can't decolonize the museum because the museum is an aspect of colonization. And museums started out as repositories for the spoils of conquest over other cultures and around the world by European empires. So you can't decolonize the museum. But what we can do is we can indigenize the museum. We can bring our perspectives, we can bring our methodologies into the museum. And we can do the same with a university. We can bring these ideals in and adopt those. And so I think, so this idea that somehow we're going to decolonize the world, it's too late for that. We're colonized, but that doesn't mean we're going to give up living in two worlds, meaning that we can still perpetuate our cultural life ways within this colonial context. And that's the fight that we have every day, to keep our identity as who we are as Indigenous peoples in this colonized world. But we're never going to decolonize the planet.
I want to put some happy hands on that and kind of swing it back around to with what Sean was asking. Sean, if you're talking about philosophical principles that are really huge, and it's about being of service and taking care of other people, right? What James said is huge. Like, maybe decolonization is like a really huge project that, we're not necessarily going to have our sustainable gardens, but we can have healthcare, right? We can house people. We can take land that is not in use and put tiny homes on them to shelter people, right? So when you're talking about what principles do you put into a statement, right? Right? We're not going to leave people unsheltered. We're not going to leave people without medicine. We are going to give access to water. We're going to make sure that the water stays clean, right? So this is the kind of thing, in these statements of people acknowledgement, these statements of, land acknowledgement, this life acknowledgement.
Thank you so much. Charlie, Chester, and James. This has been amazingly informative and a great discussion. On behalf of the Indigenous Faculty and Staff Alliance here at K-State, they would like to offer each of you tobacco ties for participating in today's discussion. Also, on behalf of the IFSA and K-State School of Music, Theater, and Dance, we would like to offer you, sorry for my Vanna White moment, but this particular painting, it's called Not Forgotten, and it was designed by Sioux artist Maxine Noel to honor and remember missing and murdered Indigenous women. Proceeds of the Not Forgotten collection will help support the Native Women's Association of Canada, a voice for the missing and murdered Indigenous women. So we'll be getting you each one of those paintings. And we'd also, I'd like to take this time to especially thank our Indigenous Faculty and Staff Alliance, especially Laverne Bitsy Baldwin. And I'd also like to thank Dr. Alex Redcorn, Dr. Lisa Tatnetti, and Dr. Melissa Paul for helping us organize this discussion. And I think it's been a tremendous amount of information and discussion. I'd like to think it is in the right direction. I do know that accountable actions are really important, but I think having these discussions and having people get to speak and listen is very, very important.
Thank you. I just want to say one final thing.
Please.
If that's okay, is that Kansas State is a land grant university, and all of the and the only lands that Kansas State benefited from were the lands of the Kaw people. Kansas State received all of its land grant money from the displacement of the Kaw people. There are other universities that had other tribes, multiple tribes that were displaced, and those universities benefited from. But Kansas State received a large sum from the sale of 87,290 acres of Kaw land. And I just wanted to put that out there.
Well, thank you.
So yes, you are on the land that we belong to.
Thank you for that, James. Any final words from our panel? Or?
And thank you very much. And
you're very welcome.
I always get revved up with these conversations, and very passionate about this, and very passionate about the Kaw people having a much greater presence in the state of Kansas. I want to thank all of you for the opportunity to have this conversation.
Yes, and it's been wonderful to hear you all speak on this. It's been a great learning curve and inspiring and necessary conversation. So I thank you all, and thank you to our participants. I'm sorry we didn't have a little bit longer for question and answers, but this was a fantastic discussion. And I thank you three again, and I thank you for joining us in Zoom land. Thank you all, and I hope we can continue this discussion.